Bob Justman, the associate producer of Star Trek, was walking through the office area of the show and was pleased to see that people were humming. Activity was in every room he peeked into, and something he wasn't sure if he wanted to know what was happening there, but he knew it was costing money. He turned the corner and entered the office of Herb Solow, the show's vice president of production. With a playful grin, Herb greeted his visitor, who seemed to have a burr in his saddle, his tone carrying an adventurous edge. "Smile, RJ, you're on candid camera." Bob, however, was not in the mood for levity, and his grimace betrayed his wariness. "Any chance you can get me onto candid camera?" he retorted. Herb shook his head, chuckling. "Sorry, since you helped get us into this mess, you have to stay. I'm not easy like Leslie Stevens over at the Outer Limits." Bob's smile grimaced and took a seat. Opening his notebook, he got straight to business, revealing the concerns he and Gene Roddenberry shared. First, Desilu wants us to use only their key people. Some of them haven't got the skills for our show. Gene and I don't want them. Herb, brushing aside their concerns with a wave of his hand, replied, "Just ignore them. Anything else?" Justman notes it down and goes to the latest challenge. The head of post-production wants us to hire no more than 3 teams of editors, max. "We need 4 if we want to make our air date schedule," he said. Herb blinked and scoffed. "Ignore him too. Anything else?" Bob leaned in, his tone laced with a hint of concern. "Okay, they'll go over your head to Lucy because I keep ignoring them." The specter of Lucille Ball, the studio's formidable owner, was always looming in the background. Herb let out a resigned sigh, knowing all too well the path that lay ahead. "Actually, RJ, they'll be going to Lucy's husband, Gary Morton. He'll go to Lucy and wind her up until she goes to Mickey Rudin and complains about Solo and his crazies." Morton had been a stand-up comedian performing in nightclubs and had a reputation as a skilled entertainer. But when he met Ball, marrying her in 1961 after her divorce from Desi Arnaz, he was an unproven quantity as a producer at the studio she now owned. Bob's eyes narrowed, awaiting the crucial "and" in this intricate game of studio politics. Herb continued, "And Mickey will once again tell her to leave Solo alone. RJ, in the long run, ignoring them will be the path of least resistance." Mickey was Lucy's attorney and consigliere, whose bare-knuckled style as an entertainment attorney made him a sought-after representative by such luminaries as Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe, among many other stars. Bob looked at Herb, looking for any hint of humor. Seeing none, he shifted his focus, hoping for smoother going. "Okay, boss. I think we are good with Matt Jeffries on production design, William Thiessen costume, and Fred Phillips on makeup," he mused, bringing the conversation back to the creative team. Herb nodded. "If you're happy, I'm happy." "Okay, one more thing. A biggie," Bob said slowly. "We are faced with the problem of finding the right cameraman to film the show. As usual, the really good ones are already working on established series. The few who are available cost too much, or else they're on the back nine of their career. The quest for a visionary cameraman to capture the essence of Star Trek was proving to be a formidable task. Herb mused, "We could kill the whole show with the wrong guy behind the lens. If Star Trek looks like some kind of voyage to the bottom of space, then we are dead in the water. We might as well film in black and white." Bob leaned in closer. "I put the word out that I was looking for someone young, energetic, and daring," he said. "Add female, and you have a personal ad for Roddenberry." Herb waved Bob out with a flick of his hand. "Staff the series your way." Later, Herb was making his way to the inner sanctum of Gene Roddenberry's office. He nodded to DC Fontana in the writer's bullpen and looked toward the office door. DC was Dorothy Fontana, who had started as Gene's secretary at MGM when he was running the show The Lieutenant. She had written scripts under the tutelage of Gene's friend from that show, Sam Rolfe, and Gene recognized her talents. No longer occupying the secretary seat outside Gene's office, she was very much more involved in creating Star Trek. Gene's secretary looked up with a smile and nodded toward the door. Herb had learned long ago to make sure Gene was decent when he wanted to go in. But hearing the clickety-clack of Gene's typewriter, he was pleased to know he was hard at work. The creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, was hunched over his typewriter, the keys popping beneath his nimble fingers, the instrument through which he breathed life into the characters and worlds of Star Trek. One hand grabbed the smoldering cigarette from the ashtray, and he took a deep drag as he stared at the paper and then looked up, feeling Herb's presence. "Hey, Herb," Gene grunted. Herb mirrored the grunt with a nod, a customary greeting between two individuals who understood each other without the need for unnecessary words. Gene leaned back in his chair, and his eyebrows jumped up in innocence. "What's up? What was this humorous telegram to NBC Vice President Grant Tinker?" Herb inquired in a no-nonsense voice. Gene's lips curled into a wry smile as he reminisced. "Several middle management executives took umbrage at my attitude towards standard network policies and procedures," he began, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. "I decided the best way to lighten up NBC was with humor." Herb says seriously, "Gene, while my secretary Lydia was calling Grant Tinker, Grant called. He asks me, 'This is the creative force behind our most expensive new series. What's with Roddenberry?' Gene chuckles. 'Can't take a joke.' 'Yeah, I told him you thought it was cute,' Herb says ruefully. 'It was.' Gene lights another cigarette, holding it between his second and third fingers. 'All we need is for some of the top NBC execs to see something like this. Let's get back to our arrangement, Gene. Others on the series will deal with NBC on routine matters. I'll deal with NBC on policy matters and problems. You stay away from NBC, far away.' Herb says with finality, 'Okay. Gene takes a drag on the cigarette. 'But tell me, what did you think of the idea for Wonder Rabbi?' 'It was great, Gene. We'll just replace Mission Impossible with it. Let Stephen Hill play the rabbi who turns in Martin Landau.' Stephen Hill was the star of the sister show at Desilu, Mission Impossible, well known for his very orthodox Judaism that tended to make scheduling more difficult for the producers over there. Gene laughs. 'I like it.' 'All right,' Herb acknowledged with a grin. 'But Gene?' 'Yeah?' Gene asked with innocent eyes. Herb says, 'No more telegrams to NBC.' Bob Justman was going over his budget when feature film cameraman Harry Stradling, a legend and a mentor to Bob, stopped in. Harry Stradling Jr. was born into a family of cinematographers and followed in the footsteps of his legendary father, crafting a career of his own, marked by versatility and artistic excellence. He was known for his ability to balance the demands of big-budget blockbusters with intimate character dramas. With him is Jerry Finnerman, one of his camera operators, a tall, good-looking young man. Bob looks up at the two. "Harry, how's it?" Harry smiles. "Fantastic, Bob. Hey, you found a cameraman for your space show?" he asked. "I got nada. You know how it is? Know anybody?" Bob says. Harry laughs. "I've got your guy right here. This is Jerry Finnerman." Bob looks over. "Oh yeah?" Harry says earnestly. "He'll make a great cameraman, Bob." Bob scoffs. "If he had any experience, I'd know about him." "You know me, Bob, and I know you need a guy with something special to shoot your show," Harry says. Jerry stands silently, looking at Bob, who is nodding. Bob stands up, looks Jerry over, and says, "I'd be taking one hell of a chance. I believe you're a good camera operator. You know how to follow the action and frame each shot properly at the same time. Otherwise, Harry wouldn't have you." Harry tries to interrupt, but Bob raises his hand. "I don't know if you can be a leader on the set, whether you can run not only your camera crew, but all the grips and electricians too, whether you can light any scene quickly and well, whether you can create the sort of dramatic mood lighting that a show like Star Trek demands. What would happen if you fell on your face? Do you think you can cut it?" Jerry nods. "Your fuck-up just cost a ton of time and money. Everybody hates you now. Are you sure you can still cut it?" Bob demanded. After a time, Jerry states, "I can cut it. Just tell me what you want to see and I'll give it to you. Anything you want." Harry speaks up again. "Bob, you know I wouldn't bring Jerry to you if I didn't think he was ready." Bob thinks about it. Harry continues. "His dad was a special effects cameraman. Jerry and I played on the same high school football team. He was the kicker, and I held for him. Once he missed the ball and almost broke my wrist instead. Jerry seemed a little embarrassed by the anecdote. But otherwise, he's on the ball. I've done some shows with him, and he's a great camera operator. I think he's ready to move up, and your show is the perfect place," Harry finished. Bob walks across the hall to see Roddenberry. Gene, I've found a guy who's still a camera operator. I believe he's got the stuff, and I want to bump him up to be our first cameraman. Gene is working on a script. What do you want me to say, Bob? Bob smiles. Say yes, Gene. Without hesitation, Gene replied, yes. Bob, if you want him, I want him. In the wardrobe room, Bill Theus is working on costumes. He looks at his sewing assistant. Keep working. Believe me, we need to stay ahead here. DeForest Kelley has a big grin on his face as he emerges from the changing room in his full uniform the day before the first segment of Star Trek was to start shooting. He says, "How do you guys like me in my jammies?" He does a quick model's twirl as Theus looks closely at the cut and lay of the garments. "How does it feel on your body?" Theus asked. "Well, I'll tell you, Bill, I ain't never worn anything like it. At least not since I got out of the Army," DeForest drawled as he turned the ring on his left pinky. Theus blinks. "You aren't a soldier here. It is a spaceship in the future. You are an explorer." "Last I heard, I was a doctor," DeForest noted. "I don't think I would be wearing the same togs as an explorer." Theus blinks again. "You're right. Your uniform would be a little different sometimes, but definitely not a lab coat." Kelley winks. "I think the word you're looking for is smock." DeForest brushes at an invisible bit of lint on his sleeve. "I like it, though, because usually all I get to wear is a dirty old cowboy rig these days." "Perish the thought," Theus exclaims. "Go ahead and take that off. I need to do some thinking. We might still be doing westerns here, but they will be better dressed." Justman is meeting again with Roddenberry late in the afternoon to talk over their biggest problem. Bob says, "We just need usable scripts." "Don't remind me," Gene says, leaning back. "We have Corbomite, Candel's space hookers, and Man-Trap very close to ready for shooting," Bob says, looking at his notes. Gene lights a cigarette. "Yeah, Black is working on the disease script. It looks good. Not quite ready, but it looks good. Matheson's got the split Kirk script into notes. It's got some standards issues. I am scheduling Corbomite as the first to shoot," Bob says. "It's got a hell of a lot of optics, but it's almost all bridge. Then we can do space hookers. I have Roger C. Carmel coming in for Harry Mudd." Gene perked up. "That's great. He's perfect. He's been on all the shows we're trying to get audience from, and he can play both the comic scenes and still play the heavy." Bob laughs. "He's available, but not cheap." Gene looks at his notes. "I want to see who we have coming in for Man-Trap. That's going to require a half-dozen different actresses for the different perception of the creature." Noted. "What about that Charlie script of yours?" Bob asks. "I like the Stranger in a Strange Land vibe, and it all takes place on the ship." Robert A. Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land was a groundbreaking science fiction novel that was a sensation a few years prior. Heinlein had moved from young adult science fiction to free-form speculative fiction that challenged conventional norms and questioned authority with its provocative ideas about love, freedom, and spirituality. Gene laughs. "Don't let Heinlein or the lawyers hear you say that. I junked it. There just isn't room for any action, and I promised action-adventure to the network. Could use some money for a good young guest star to up the hip factor. I got Joe DaGosta looking around. He gave me Dennis Hopper as a good choice, but he's gone to film." Gene lights up. "Dennis is great. He was wonderful in The Lieutenant with Nichelle and Don Marshall." Bob nods. "He has some kid actors looking to shed their skin and become adults. Kurt Russell, Dean Stockwell, Brandon DeWilde, Robert Walker Jr. "Yeah, any of them might work. I trust Joe," Gene said, losing interest. Bob smiles wryly. "You look at these 4 scripts we just talked about, and there's not a lot of action in any of them." Gene grounds out his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray. "Shit, you're right. Maybe instead of science fiction writers writing action-adventure, we need action-adventure writers writing science fiction." "Let's do this. Why don't you give that Charlie script to DC? I've been impressed by her story analysis. I think she's ready to take on an assignment, and boy, do we need another script," Bob said. "Good, fine. You're right, of course. It's worth a try." Gene said, "We've got to get these scripts by established writers in production. I believe we must have science fiction credibility in addition to scientific credibility." Justman mimics, taking a note. Got it, but sci-fi is some cerebral shit. That's why it's so hard to dramatize. We can't just fall back on a baroom fight or shootout to wrap up every script. Don't I know it? Gene laughs. We need to get some real hard science writers in here and school them on television scripts. And budgets, Justman adds. Yeah, Gene nods. They will have a tough time fitting into a television screen. Robert Bloch has sent in an outline for a kind of alien robot story. Seems interesting. I get flashbacks when I hear alien robot, Bob says. Gene laughed at the look on Bob's face. I hear you. We definitely don't want to get locked into some kind of monster of the week by the network, like Outer Limits. Bob looked up from the cluttered desk, the corners of his mouth curling into the faint shadow of a smile. Hey, listen, he said, his voice low but steady, like the start of a story waiting to unfold. Let me put you in contact with Harlan Ellison. I worked with him at the Outer Limits on that Glass Hand episode. The name Harlan Ellison carried weight, sharp and jagged, like the stories he spun. He was a man who never softened his edges, whose words could cut as deeply as they could inspire. He was New York literary, a novel, and then his stories found their way onto the small screen, shaping episodes of Burke's Law, Route 66, and the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. On the Outer Limits, he didn't just write, he redefined. Demon with a Glass Hand wasn't just an episode. It was a piece of speculative fiction that shimmered with ambition, the kind of work that lingered in the mind long after the credits rolled. Oh, that was a good one, Gene said. Ellison was more than just a name, more than a writer or a provocateur. He was known as a force relentless in his pursuit of a story worth telling. He could craft a world in a single sentence and make you question everything in the span of a page. Yeah, he came in with this original version that had some kind of cross-country chase that was great on paper, but on that show, we had no budget from ABC. Glad things are so improved here. Ha! But I'm trying to figure out a way to get it shot on a shoestring. So I take Harlan to this building in LA, and I convince him to set the whole chase within the building. That's a pretty fair idea, Gene nodded. Yeah, he ran with it and came up with a great story. Award-winning. I'll get his number to you, Bob said, making a note. Gene turns in his chair. I'll be here chained to the fucking typewriter. I'm gonna go talk to our new DP, Bob says as he heads out the door. Try not to scare him off, Gene says ruefully. Herb Solo's secretary buzzes him at his desk that NBC VP Herb Schlosser is calling. Herb signs and says, put him on. Herb Schlosser was an up-and-comer at NBC. He began his career as a corporate lawyer in New York and then joined the business affairs department at NBC in 1960, personally negotiating the agreements that brought Johnny Carson from ABC to NBC to host The Tonight Show. Solo picks up the phone and says, Schloss, what can I do for you? The sales department wants Spock to have regular ears and eyebrows, Schlosser says, diving right in. Herb sighs, NBC sales is crazy. Tell them to kindly butt out. The whole concept of having a space alien aboard the Enterprise would be destroyed. No deal. Schlosser stated, they're really serious. You'd better talk with Roddenberry. Herb says, we already talked about it. Sales are living in fear while we're trying to make a successful television show. What did Roddenberry say? Schlosser asks. He agrees with me. No ears, no show. All I ask is that you keep an open mind, Schlosser asks. Noted. Goodbye, Herb. In a quieter corner of the building, Bob leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Jerry Finnerman. The new director of photography was young, eager, and had the look of someone ready to prove himself. Bob saw the spark and was about to fan it into a fire. Jerry, Bob began, his voice measured but insistent, you've got to free yourself from the tired techniques of the past. We're all in outer space now, and we're in color. NBC's out there bragging about being the first full-color network. Let's make them proud. Jerry nodded, his hands clasped behind his back, taking it in like a student before the master. When you light the sets, Bob continued, don't just think about realism. Think about drama. Throw wild colors into the mix, magenta, red, green, hell, any color you can find, especially behind the actors when they're in close shots. Make it bold, make it pop. Backlight the women and make them stunning. Push the boundaries. Go overboard. Jerry laughed softly at that, the sound breaking the tension of the moment. And here's the thing, Bob leaned forward, lowering his voice as if to share a secret. Nobody can tell you that's not the way the future looks. How could they? They ain't been there yet. Jerry grinned. The spark was starting to catch. But there's a catch. Bob straightened, his tone sharpening. We've only got so much money and even less time. Each episode has to be a miracle, and miracles don't come cheap. You'll need to work with the set guys, our gnomes. See what surfaces you're working with and plan around them. You've got to develop cinematography on a shoestring budget. Jerry nodded. I had a system in college that saved a lot of money. It might work here. Bob raised an eyebrow. Good. Tell me more about it later. Every dime you save gives us a chance to shoot something more interesting. Jerry saluted playfully. Aye, aye, sir. Bob chuckled but quickly grew serious. Once you get to know me, you'll see I'm rarely one for hyperbole. Jerry tilted his head, unsure if that was entirely true. I'm serious, Bob said, leaning in, his voice low but charged. I think we've got a real chance here, to create something great, something nobody's seen before. But to do that, we've got to make the television of the future with the tools of the past. Jerry's grin faded, replaced by something more thoughtful. He glanced around the room at the remnants of old ideas and worn-out tools. Then he looked back at Bob, seeing the fire in his eyes. We'll make it work, Jerry said. Bob nodded. We don't have a choice. The music room was dimly lit, the faint glow of a desk lamp reflecting off scattered sheets of manuscript paper. Alexander Sandy Courage sat at his piano, fingers dancing lightly across the keys as the familiar strains of the Star Trek theme filled the air. The notes swirled around the room, rising and fading like echoes of exploration. Sandy paused, pencil in hand, jotting down a variation, his mind drifting to the possibilities of what could be. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the melody like a dissonant chord. He sighed, got up, and crossed the room to pick up the receiver. This is Sandy Courage, he said, his voice calm and professional. The voice on the other end was anything but. Rough, almost sneering, it barked out, Alexander Courage? This is Leonard Maislish, Gene Roddenberry's attorney. Listen carefully. From now on, we're collecting half of your royalties. Sandy blinked, stunned. Excuse me, what are you talking about? But the line had already gone dead. He stood there for a moment, staring at the phone as if it might explain itself. Then, with a shake of his head, he reached for the rotary dial and punched in a familiar number. After a few rings, Wilbur Hatch, head of Desilu's music department, picked up. Wilbur, it's Sandy, Courage began, his voice tight with frustration. I just got a call from Gene's lawyer, Maislish. He says they're taking half my royalties. What the hell is going on? There was a pause on the other end before Hatch's voice came through, slow and cautious. Yes, Sandy, we've heard about this. You'd better talk to Ed Pearlstein, the studio attorney. Sandy wasted no time dialing Pearlstein, but the conversation left him no more satisfied. There's nothing we can do, legally, Pearlstein said, his tone flat. It's in the contract. Sandy hung up the phone harder than he intended, the sharp sound echoing in the quiet room. He sat back at the piano, but his hands didn't touch the keys. The music was gone, replaced by a gnawing frustration. Later, he confronted Roddenberry directly. Gene, what's this about taking half my royalties? How could you do this? Gene Roddenberry leaned back in his chair, the ever-present cigarette dangling from his fingers. Hey, Sandy, he said with a shrug. I've got to get money from somewhere. I'm sure not going to see it from the profits of Star Trek. The nonchalance stung more than the act itself. Sandy clenched his fists, his voice low but firm. If you'd added lyrics to make the theme more commercially viable, to attract singers and build value for the show, that'd be one thing. But Gene, your lyrics don't even work musically. Roddenberry raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Sandy explained, the frustration evident in his tone. You made two big mistakes. First, you changed the shape of the melody by adding extra beats. It disrupts the flow. Second, you put a closed vowel sound with a zzzzz's on the highest notes. That's a nightmare for singers. Roddenberry exhaled smoke and waved a hand dismissively. Details, Sandy. Details. Sandy later cornered Bob Justman in the corridor and vented his frustration. This whole thing just reeks. I've never seen anything like it. Bob nodded, his expression grim. I didn't know about the royalties, Sandy. I swear. I know, Bob, Courage said with a weary sigh. But take my advice. Watch your back around here. Things aren't always what they seem. Bob gave a thin smile. Always, Maestro. Always. Sandy returned to the music room, his fingers finding the keys again. The notes were still there, waiting for him, but they felt heavier somehow, weighed down by the compromises and betrayals of an industry that demanded brilliance but often repaid it with indifference. As he played, the familiar theme began to rise once more, but now it carried an undercurrent of melancholy, an echo of a starship's lonely journey through an uncharted, unforgiving universe. In his dimly lit office, Gene Roddenberry sat hunched over the typewriter, the rhythmic clacking of keys filling the room as words took shape on the page. His desk was a cluttered battlefield of crumpled drafts, scattered memos, and half-empty coffee cups, each a testament to the long hours he spent breathing life into his vision. He finished typing a line, then sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The glow from the desk lamp cast long shadows, and the faint aroma of stale smoke lingered in the air. Roddenberry reached for a cigarette from the pack beside his typewriter, tapping it on the desk before lighting it with a practiced flick of his lighter. The first drag seemed to calm him, the smoke curling lazily upward as he leaned back to reread the page in front of him. After a moment, his eyes drifted to the clock on the wall, its relentless ticking reminding him of the mounting pressure to deliver. With a sigh, he picked up the phone and thumbed through the scattered papers on his desk until he found a note with a scribbled number. He dialed, listening to the metallic clicks as the connection went through. On the other end, a voice answered, brisk and sharp despite the late hour. Definitely a writer, Roddenberry thought. Gene straightened up, his cigarette dangling from his fingers. Hello? Harlan Ellison? Yes, this is, Gene Roddenberry. He took a quick drag, exhaling as he spoke. I got your number from Bob Justman. Yeah, he mentioned you. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about a project we're working on over here. There was a pause, the faint hum of the line buzzing between them. Gene pressed on. We're putting together a new show. It's something like a sophisticated wagon train to the stars. He winced slightly, anticipating the reaction, but Ellison didn't interrupt. Yeah, I know how it sounds, but look, the idea's bigger than that. It's got real potential. And the one thing we're committed to is keeping the content level high. Really high. Gene leaned forward, his elbow on the desk, the cigarette trailing ash over the papers. I want to get some real science fiction writers in here. Not just the usual TV guys cranking out scripts, you know? People who can bring depth, imagination, something with teeth. You've got the kind of voice we need. I'd love to hear what you think. Gene smiled faintly, his tension easing. Great. I'll have Bob get you the details. Thanks, Harlan. Really appreciate it. Bye now. He hung up the receiver with a soft click, leaning back in his chair and taking another drag from his cigarette. The smoke swirled upward, dissipating into the dim light. For the first time that day, Gene allowed himself a flicker of satisfaction. If he could get the right minds on this show, maybe, just maybe, it could become something extraordinary. Something that would endure.